Well, it's easy, in fact, seductive for someone to say that a particular experience is unique, but this is certainly unique because it's the coming together of two, what could turn out to be two historical events. I mean, historical events which are going to have massive implications for the whole of the UK and in particular, of course, for England and Scotland, namely the triggering of so-called Brexit process, and also perhaps, at least in terms of the Scottish Parliament's decision, a move towards a second independence referendum, which could, of course, result in the breakup of the United Kingdom. So I personally have not. I've been thinking about this because I thought you might ask it. Certainly since 1707, I've never come across such a coincidence of extraordinary events occurring in the same week.
Yeah, because Brexit, Scottish independence, that convergence, and the collapse of the government in Northern Ireland as well.
Absolutely. And of course, strange behaviour on the other side of the Atlantic.
You've written extensively about the Scottish diaspora. How do you see our relationship with Europe and further afield being shaped by what Theresa May achieves in the next 2 years?
Well, I've got very great doubts how much she will achieve. I'm glad to say that over the last few days, people who have been silent on this issue have started to come out and articulate a view that there is a whole forest of complexities in terms of the movement towards an agreed position. And remember, that's all got to be done over 18 months, not 2 years. Personally, I don't think that's possible. And I would rather depend upon the view of the experienced view, the knowledgeable view of the previous UK ambassador to the EU, Ivan Roberts, who asserted several months ago that this would be at least a 10-year period. And personally also I'm on record as saying that I'm doubtful, one cannot predict the future of course, but I'm doubtful whether there will be a Brexit at all.
In what sense? Explain that to us.
Well, because there's simply so many obstacles, many of them not yet revealed, because even the Remain press has been quite quiet about this and more or less accepting a victory, an inevitable victory for the process at the end of the period. I mean, there's a number of things. First of all, every member state has a veto, individually. Secondly, as I have already indicated, the sheer complexity of the negotiating process. Thirdly, there are some signs the Labour Party at last is beginning to note the horrible possibilities that might exist for our economy in the UK and our people if there is a hard Brexit at the end of the day. And finally, although it's not yet in law, the Conservative Party has more or less boxed itself into a situation where it will have to accept a vote by the Sovereign Parliament at the end of the process. And if it doesn't accept that vote, I would expect more judicial intervention. So
you would expect ultimately that those on the Remain side might be in the ascendancy by the end of this process?
It's very possible. I mean, I go back to what I said earlier, Gary. We cannot predict the future. But I think it's at least 50-50, at least that there will not necessarily be a Brexit at the end of the process, which of course has got huge implications for the Scottish situation and the timing of any future referendum. When I argued about this a few weeks ago, long before Theresa May came out with her obdurate statements, my view was that the process should be started, aka the arrangements made for another referendum, but the powder should be kept dry until we see the shape, if we do ever see the shape of the beast at the end of the day.
So has Nicola Sturgeon perhaps played her hand a little too early?
I think so, yeah. That would be my view.
And what were the consequences of that?
Well, the consequences are now she's... she had to indicate a particular position, albeit in vague terms, because she, like May, was becoming boxed in. And if she hadn't done something or said something, the credibility would have collapsed. But it could have been said in almost the same sort of way as May behaves. I mean, she doesn't really say very much. I mean, obviously she says no, but she doesn't give her hand away. And the big question for Nicola Sturgeon now is, if May adheres to her position, which she's unlikely to shift on because that's her track record both in the Home Office and now since she become PM, where does Nicola Sturgeon go? What ammunition has she got? Does she go back to history and look at the way the Irish MPs behaved in the late 19th century by resigning en masse from Parliament? Does she call a Scottish election? I think the possibility of doing a mock poll is ridiculous because unionists will simply ignore it. So it'll be a very big test for the First Minister.
Isn't the hope perhaps on the part of those who are pro-independence that because of all the uncertainty, and we could even use the word chaos, that might ensue from Brexit, as you outlined at the beginning of this interview, that might drive the polls in terms of more people believing that an independent Scotland is better off out of the UK?
Well, the longer that May behaves the way she's been behaving, the more the thousands will mount in terms of the pro-exit view, the independence view in Scotland. I mean, she is a tremendous cheerleader, as ironically enough her female predecessor, Mrs Thatcher, was, who is now known historically as the mother of Scottish nationalism. So it's a tremendous cheerleader for that. So, I mean, if I was in Sturgeon's part, I would just more or less let it be. Protest, of course, it's a disgrace that, if you want to put it this way, the will of the Scottish people through their parliament and the will of the Scottish people, if you like, through the SNP members in Parliament, with hardly any representation from any other party, has been betrayed by this government. And again, that's unlikely to redound to negative as far as the pro-independence cause is concerned.
But she does have a difficulty, doesn't she? Because a social attitude survey said that there is a growing anti-EU sentiment in Scotland, maybe not anti-European as such. We know, of course, the numbers in terms of those who voted yes and voted SNP, who voted to leave the EU, and then there's the doubt as to whether those who voted to stay in the UK last time round actually believe that independence is a better option than Brexit.
I know, all these complexities. This is why it makes it so fascinating for our trade, because nobody knows what is going to happen. All we're talking about, however, is the absolute fundamental position of our country in the future. You know, our children and our grandchildren.
But some people believe that independence is inevitable. Do you see it that way?
Well, demographically, and in a sense, this is the same as Northern Ireland. If you look at the demographics of the two countries, if you look, for example, at Northern Ireland to begin with, then it's quite clear. I can't put a precise date on it, but eventually, demographically, people from a Catholic nationalist background will outbid in terms of numbers people from a unionist background. Now, you never can tell how that will be used by Sinn Féin or by nationalists, but it will become a fact. And as my learned colleague John Curtis has said, if they just wait a little, that is the SNP, then demographic history and indeed demographic future is on their side.
That's because of the number of young people, particularly, who support the idea of independence.
There's a heavy orientation towards pro-independence on the part of those below the age of 40, 35. And of course, as you know, equally, there's a heavy orientation to those who support the union at the other end of the spectrum. But nobody lives forever.
Theresa May, of course, has said during this visit to Scotland that she can see Brexit strengthening the union, strengthening the UK. Can you see circumstances where that might happen?
Well, I think that's the sort of thing where, you know, the kind of response I have to that. Certainly as we speak, Gary, you know, we don't really know what's going to happen. But as we speak, I think that's a ludicrous position to take up. In fact, it's almost comic, because it's precisely the fear of Brexit that's resulted in another crisis in the union.
But might there not be perhaps a sort of Dunkirk spirit, if I could put it that way, amongst people in the UK believing, well, we're now going to be out of the EU, so we need to pull together in some way? I
think to a very large extent on what I would call a pragmatic response once we know more about the likely terms. And if the terms are as horrendous as some people are saying in terms of a hard Brexit, then I think pragmatically, in terms of prudence, whether there's a recollection of pulling together in the past or not, people will react in a certain way. The other thing that's got to be remembered, which is absolutely fascinating to me, because I've always thought that what will destroy the union are the English, not the Scots. Two polls recently, a sample of those who voted for out in the north of England and the Midlands, overwhelming view they'd be quite comfortable with Scots leaving the union if it meant that there would still be a Brexit. Okay. Second one, even more intriguing, 600 members of Conservative associations recently analysed and only published the other day, clear signs of frustration with the Scots. We want to, in a sense, if not get rid of them, we want to be assured that there won't be any more demands from them. And again, a degree of comfort about Scotia leaving the Union. Now, that is entirely new. It was beginning to happen with the rise of English nationalism even in 2014. But it's now become robust, or more robust, because of Brexit and the fact that Brexit has spawned a kind of insular, little Englandism. And of course, there is the very strong view in some political quarters, and I mean some social classes in England, that the Scots have been ripping England off for years.
You said earlier that you believed that maybe Nicola Sturgeon had gone a little too quickly in terms of the time frame that she'd outlined for a second independence referendum. What are the consequences for her, for her party, for Scotland, if it does happen in the time frame she's set out and it's another no vote?
Well, it's got a dammerung. In a sense, 2014 wasn't quite as serious as that, because that was the first time. If there's a second vote and it's still denial, it's still no, that's it. I mean, automatically Sturgeon will resign, her career's over. The implications for the governing party, perhaps more problematic, but it's not going to be very good for them. And at the same time, certainly for people of my generation and the generation before me, that's over forever and a day.
Just a final point. You talked earlier about Margaret Thatcher being the architect of modern day nationalism. If we look at David Cameron sparking this whole process of Brexit and bringing us to the position that we've discussed during this interview, how do you think history will judge the Conservative and Unionist Party if, as you believe, ultimately the Union will come to an end?
Well, it's very interesting because I didn't make this point explicit in a book which was published earlier this year. But one reviewer, who was actually, from a unionist background, said that the evidence in this book is compelling, that the force which weakened the Union was modern conservatism, by, of course, the behaviour of the succession of Conservative governments in the 1980s and early 1990s. And now the kind of indefatigability of May, not willing to go for any kind of consensus, at least thus far, not even willing to give the Scottish Government the courtesy of responding. That's putting the potential continuation of the Union into deeper and deeper problematic. So in a sense, there's a line between the behaviour of the Tories in the 80s and today, and it's really quite extraordinary from the point of view of an historian, because in the 50s and 60s, when there was very considerable support for Conservative governments in Scotland, the Conservatives had a very good antennae and sensitivity to Scottish opinion, which has been completely and comprehensively lost, and the result is destabilisation of the Union.